So once again, please make sure that your speakers are muted, your sound is muted. This morning's lecturer, George Manginis, studied archaeology and history of art at the University of Athens and at SOAS University of London, where he was awarded a PhD with a superlative dissertation on the Aia Koryphi at Sinai. His interest in the holy monastery at Sinai, and especially in the mountainous peak that rises dramatically behind it, known as the place where Moses received the 10 Commandments from God as described in the book of Exodus, resulted in his 2016 monograph, Mount Sinai, A History of Travelers and Pilgrims, in a number of important articles, and in his role since 2018 as a trustee of the St. Catherine Foundation. Moving beyond this initial research focus, he has published scholarly articles on Cypriot prehistory, Islamic art and architecture, Chinese ceramics, and Greek and Armenian diasporas. And here I want to draw your attention to his recent study, China Rediscovered, the Benaki Museum collection of Chinese ceramics of 2016. In addition to his scholarly work, he has taught Byzantine, Islamic, and Chinese art at a number of prestigious institutions, including SOAS, the Courtauld Institute, the University of Edinburgh, the Institute of Ismaili Studies, the Aga Khan University, and elsewhere. Over the last month, you've come to know Dr. Manginis in his role as the academic director of the Benaki Museum, a role he has happily held since 2018, following stints at the Kadokouzenos House Museum and the Hellenic Children's Museum in Athens, the Greek Orthodox Cathedral at St. Sophia in London, and the Archaeological Museum of Ioannina. So we see in George Manginis a scholar of exceptional breadth, intelligence, and talent. And I will say on behalf of our UCLA Center that it has been an absolute delight to work with him in arranging this lecture series, one that we hope to continue in the fall. Today's lecture, For the Benefit of the Nation, a collection of Chinese art for Greece, continues our examination of Greek collectors, and particularly those who made it their mission to enrich the Greek state by bequeathing their collections to the Benaki and other museums in Greece, and in this case, also in England. As Dr. Manginis eloquently stated last week, collectors are magicians that create worlds, and we have been privileged to enter some of these special worlds in the last few weeks. Those of us who have worked with collectors, myself included, know the nature of the beast. Collecting is a passion, one that can even place the collector in financial peril for the sake of acquisition. Collections can be incredibly idiosyncratic, and collectors, well, they have their own personality traits. We were briefly introduced to the collector that forms the center of today's lecture in Mina Moraitu's spectacular lecture last week. We found out that Antonis Benakis had been in contact with George Eumorfopoulos, a British businessman born in 1863 in Liverpool, to a family of Greek refugees that had fled the Ottoman massacre of Chios in 1822. But who was this Eumorfopoulos? How did he amass one of the most extensive collections of Chinese ceramics that the world has ever seen? Was he simply a man of his time, a smart businessman, a patriot, a dreamer, or was he a visionary? I invite Dr. Manginis to introduce you to the world of this special collector and to his collection in For the Benefit of the Nation, a collection of Chinese art for Greece.
Thank you very much, Sharon. And Sharon has been a delight to work with through these weeks. And I'm particularly indebted for the invitation to organize this cycle of lectures. And also, I'm so indebted to all of you that have been joining every Thursday morning afternoon or evening for our series. Now I will share my screen. With you. Brilliant. Now, as Sharon pointed out, this is not so much a collection, a lecture on Chinese ceramics or Chinese art or Chinese history. It's, as the title says, a lecture on a collection of Chinese ceramics, and specifically one that was created for Greece. As such, it falls very well within the title Hellenic Together of our lectures. So in order to approach the subject more systematically, I have to peel away the pots from the man and look at the collector in some detail. Then we will also look at the destiny of the collection after it was bequeathed to the Benaki. And since we have to take the story from some point, I will start from where last week's speaker, Mina Moraitu, left the story. From the inauguration of the Benaki Museum on the 22nd of April 1931 in Athens. We see here an article from a newspaper, and we see Mr. Benakis looking dapper as always, and we read all the addresses by the officials that attended the opening. And I would like to draw your attention to a quote by the then Minister of Education, George Papandreou, Sr., back in 1931, who opened his address with the following words. In the name of the nation and with deep emotion, we receive the Benaki Museum, because the museum was offered, of course, to the Greek nation. And we extend towards you, Mr. Antonis Benakis, towards the noble ladies, your sisters, and towards the distinguished Greek, Mr. George Eumorfopoulos, our expression of national gratitude. Who was Eumorfopoulos, or as we Greeks call him, Eumorfopoulos, the good-looking? Actually, that's what it means. Or as his friends in England called him Eumo, because Eumorfopoulos was rather long. Why did he receive such a mention? What did he do to deserve it? Because he appears up there with the Benaki family in the opening address. How did he come to become such a great donor? And finally, why is he largely, or to be honest, completely forgotten today? Now, in the briefest of bios, which was asked for by Benakis in 1935 for a Greek newspaper, Eumorfopoulos described himself very laconically thus. I was born in Liverpool, the 18th of April, 1863. In 1866, my father came to London. He was working in cereal grain trade with Russia, and it was in this trade that I started my commercial career. I joined the firm of Raleigh Brothers on the 1st of January 1902, and I stayed there until I retired on the 1st of February 1935. In 1891, I started collecting European ceramic objects. After a few years, I started buying Chinese ones, which gave me so much more pleasure that I decided to sell the European ones and devote myself to the Chinese. The name may not mean much to people who are specialist in the Hellenic world, but he is legendary in the historiography of Chinese art. And however, the questions do remain for someone who knows the history of collectors of Greek extraction and great benefactors. So who was he? What were the sides of the collector? What was the beast like? And this I would like to explore further with you. As Sharon pointed out, the Eumorfopoulos family originated from the island of Chios. Chios was destroyed by the Ottoman army in April 1822. A lot of people were massacred or enslaved. The family, the grandparents of George Eumorfopoulos left. They moved to Syros and then on to Piraeus, both the major commercial centers of the Greek world at the time in the Aegean. And following the route of many Greeks that were proficient in trade, they found themselves in the UK very soon, in the mid-19th century. So he becomes the Greek expatriate. He's born in Liverpool, as he wrote in his bio, in 1863, and as a toddler, he moves to London. And the first registration of Eumorfopoulos that I have managed to find was at the archive of the Greek Cathedral in London. And it's this book, it's a registered book for the Greek College. And here on a page, he appears there, he is G.A. Eumorfopoulos, and these are the fees that his father paid for his son's education in Greek. Actually, Eumorfopoulos' father, Aristides Eumorfopoulos, was the president of the board of the college. So tradespeople, but also deeply committed to an education, and for that matter, a Greek education. The head teacher of the college was Dimitris Vikelas, a Greek scholar, author, and later on a member of the committee of the first Olympic Games in Athens. So this is where he got his good Greek, because at the Benaki we have about 100 letters exchanged between him and Benakis in later years, and his Greek is very correct, a bit archaic, of course, by the 1920s, because he learned it back in the 1870s, but there's no spelling mistakes or funny syntax things. Now, in 1873, a young Constantine Cavafy was also living around the corner from the Eumorfopoulos family. The Eumorfopoulos lived at 12 Stanley Gardens, Notting Hill. And I always like to believe that the two boys played in the cathedral garden after a Sunday service. Eumorfopoulos was, like most Greeks at the time, very much connected to the Greek community, and he was a church warden of the cathedral a couple of times. We see him here in a cartoon by Frederick Carl, recording the major members of the Baltic Exchange, and he is here 30 years old, the perfect capitalist in a top hat and a business suit. He started working for the family firm and soon moved to Raleigh Brothers. And it's hard to exaggerate the importance of Raleigh Brothers as a trading firm. It was the biggest trading firm of the British Empire. And they were trading mostly with India, but also with China. And so young George was in direct contact with merchandise moving between the East, and London, the commercial capital of the world. So that was George the expatriate, George the businessman, the tradesman, but we now have to come to George the collector. And he was indeed a consummate collector, and I would like to explore with you the tradition into which he falls. So I will take you back a few centuries and to an unexpected place. This is a 19th century photograph of the Ardabil shrine in North Iran. And it shows the walls of the porcelain kiosk pavilion, which is in this famous shrine, which is the ancestral shrine of the Safavid Shahs who ruled from the 16th century onwards the country. We see here a profusion of niches on the upper registers of the walls, and on the floor, dozens and dozens of Chinese porcelain and stoneware vases and jars. The niches would accommodate, each niche would be fashioned around a specific vase. So they would make for a stunning display, exemplifying, of course, wealth. The collection had been accumulated over many years and actually dated back to the previous dynasty. And they would be displayed gloriously in this room. This is a tradition that in the case of Iran continued even if there were no pots to place in the niche, or actually it would have been impossible to place any pots because the niches were on the ceiling. Now, Chinese ceramics, Chinese porcelain was a very well-known import into the Middle East from actually many centuries before this, before the Safavid era, before the 16th and 17th centuries. And I am showing you here a wonderful 16th century censer from our collection, which is inscribed with a poem by the Nishapur Sufi poet Attar. And it was inscribed by someone who probably didn't know how to write very well the Persian script, but definitely the person who commissioned the coupling of the poem and the object knew what he was talking about, because the poem refers to scent, and the censer, of course, is an object that diffuses a beautiful perfume. Chinese potters were wonderfully adept at producing wares for export, for markets that demanded things for special reason. And beyond the Middle East, also Europe commissioned wares in the blue and white porcelain, this mysterious, perfectly suited for long distance travel material that had not been discovered in Europe before the early 18th century. Here we have a large dish, a charger, as they're sometimes called, with the arms of the monastic order of the Augustine monks. And we see a Habsburg eagle, but the crown has been transposed into a basket of flowers. It was made in China, but for a monastery, perhaps in the Iberian Peninsula, or even in Mexico or another of the colonies in America. So the Chinese from early on, even from pre-modern times, produced these wares for contemporary markets. In Europe, the Portuguese were the first, and the Dutch went second. There's very few still lives by any Dutch painter that do not feature some Chinese porcelain in one way or the other. I have chosen this specific painting because it does have a ewer made probably for the Portuguese market and a dish made for general export. We find this sort of dish pretty much everywhere. Now, the quantities of porcelain available in Europe were not very many before the 17th century. But in the 17th century, and thanks to the Dutch East Indies Company, the volume exploded. And by the 18th century, European collectors and European decorators, like the gentleman here, Daniel Marot, could indulge in hundreds and hundreds of these exotic products, which they used in decorative schemes. Now, I couldn't possibly make an effort to count all the pots in the print I showed you before, so I have focused on a small section, and I took the time and counted every single cup and saucer and vase in this detail, and there are 162 of them. So if on one wall you had about 400 of these Chinese porcelains, you realize that they were widely available and of course produced at an industrial scale back in China. There are many porcelain rooms that dominate the European decorative arts in the 18th century. I think the most splendid one is this in Charlottenburg in Berlin. Now, the 18th century was dominated by la maladie de porcelaine, the illness of porcelain. And every princeling and every king and every rich aristocrat would import large quantities. And we are lucky to have in the Benaki collection, bequeathed by Eumorfopoulos, this bowl, which has a rather inconspicuous scribbled numeral at the bottom, and it enables us to know that it was a part of the collection of Augustus II, Augustus the Strong of Dresden. And he was, of course, the potentate that funded the creation of the first porcelain factory in Europe, in Meissen, Saxony. Apart from porcelains decorated, especially commissioned and decorated in Chinese taste, we already saw commissions for the Middle Eastern and the European market. Originally, these things were for kings and rulers, but by the mid-18th century, they had become accessible enough to be commissioned by aristocrats, like the Spanish aristocrat Pignatelli, the Marquis of Ruby, who ordered his coat of arms on this cup. And even a young republic on the other side of the Atlantic was able to order Chinese porcelain for its tables. And there is a bowl with the arms of the state of New York, interpreted rather than the proper coat of arms, but with initials of the person who ordered it. Up to now, all these Chinese exports, widely collected, used in decorative schemes, expensive as they were contemporary to the time of their usage in Europe. There was perhaps a 3, 4, 5-year hiatus. For the first time, Chinese antiques became widely collectible in the 19th century. And this coincided, and I don't know if it is an accident or not, with the first political entanglement, and it wasn't a happy one, between China and the West. As you probably all know, 1860 was the time when the Second Opium War resulted in the most atrocious act of vandalism, the sacking of the Summer Palace in Peking by the English and the French forces, but also 1860, which marked the lowest point in the contact between China and the West, was when the aesthetic movement started discovering Chinese porcelain again, but not contemporary Chinese porcelain, 17th and 18th century blue and white. This is a famous cartoon from the satirical newspaper Punch, dated about 20 years later. And we see here a man called the aesthetic bridegroom and a lady called oh God, I can't make it, something bride, the intrepid bride, something like that. And he looks very much like Oscar Wilde, and it's very intentional too. And please notice her hairdo, her hair. You'll see why later on. They both look at this teapot she's holding, and he tells her, "It is quite consummate, is it not?" And she replies, "It is indeed. Oh, Algernon, let us live up to it." Algernon is very often used in satirical references to aesthetic movement men at the time. And actually, the whole thing refers to an exhibition in London of a teapot, a Chinese teapot, that was accompanied by a motto saying, "Go back home and live up to it." It was the aesthetic standard that the teapot set for rather design-weary Victorians. The cartoon is entitled "The 6 Mark Teapot," and of course the mark is the Kangxi reign mark. It is the mark of a specific emperor from the late 17th, early 18th century, whose reign saw the production of perhaps the most beautiful blue and white in enormous quantities, exported widely to the West. Now, this craze for Chinese blue and white in the 1860s and 70s met its high point, at least in England, in the creation of the famous Peacock Room, which is today at the National Museum of Asian Art in Washington, D.C. The person who commissioned it was Frederick Richards Leyland, a ship owner, and the artistic genius behind it was James McNeill Whistler, who with Rossetti, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, are credited as being the people that inspired this love for Chinese porcelain at the time. Now, the painting at the center of this room it features a lady, a beautiful lady, and please notice her hairdo, this sort of fluffy dark hair, dressed in the Japanese manner, actually, and in front of a Japanese screen. And she's labeled La Princesse du Pays de la Porcelaine, the princess of the country of porcelain. But this country is not Japan, it is China. The lady is a Greek. The model for this Chinese princess is a Greek lady. Her name is Christina Spartali, and she appears on the left, photographed by the great Victorian portrait photographer Julia Margaret Cameron. Her sister, Maria Spartali, married to a Mr. Stillman, appears immediately to the right, here painted by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. The Spartali sisters were daughters of a Greek diplomat living in London, and they were famously beautiful and much sought after as models by the greatest painters and photographers at the time. But they were not alone. Third in the row is Aglaia Koroniou, Another Greek beauty, again painted by Rossetti. And last is Maria Zambacu, painted as the sorceress, Nimue, beguiling Merlin in Edward Burne-Jones's famous work of art. Greek ladies were much sought after at the time among the artistic glitterati of Victorian London. They were dark, they were beautiful, and most of them were quite a catch. They were very wealthy. Maria Zambacu is famed as the model for perhaps all three of the graces in the famous work by Burne-Jones that we see here. Maria Zambacu was the niece of the most famous and rich Greek at the time, Alexander Ionides. Ionides commissioned a real palace of art, one of the most beautiful houses at the time, by Philip Webb and William Morris at #1 Holland Park. He was a major collector who bequeathed his collection to the Victoria and Albert Museum, where you can still see it in the dedicated Ionides room. So we now sort of come full circle, because we saw what the taste for collecting Chinese art was from, let's say, the 16th century onwards in the Middle East and in the West. And we saw how this taste percolated into the biggest collectors of Victorian London, the people who would have fashioned the taste of young George Eumorfopoulos. Among them, of course, the Ionides were predominant. And their legacy, a legacy of money, fashion, and good taste, must have inspired the aspiring young Eumorfopoulos. We see him here with his young bride, looking like the perfect Victorian gentleman in his huge bushy beard. Another connection. These two portraits, now the collection of the V&A, were painted by Watts. George Frederick Watts was an invention, a creation of the Ionides clan. Eumorfopoulos, as we saw, started collecting European art and very soon shifted to Chinese. His house at #7 Chelsea Embankment, it's all the house that fills this photograph. So it extends over 5 floors, and it goes back to the Mews Alley behind the house. So it's a vast complex today, I have to admit, split up into several flats, sat on the bank of the Thames. It was fashionably built in the 1870s, but he bought it actually in the early 20s, when he was already quite a successful member of the Raleigh Brothers firm. If we opened the door into this beautiful house, we would see it decorated in a somewhat conventional style. So there is an amalgam of medieval and Baroque furniture. There are decorative screens, there's Georgian furniture, there is French settees, and of course the necessary cases of Chinese porcelain. And what we see here is mostly blue and white or enameled 18th century porcelains. Notice the vase at the bottom right-hand corner, which we're lucky to have at the Benaki, very typically a blue and red on white 18th century vase. Now, Eumorfopoulos was not only a Chinese art collector, he had some exceptional Islamic art pieces, which he housed in a mock Tudor-Beethoven annex of the house. And I would like to draw your attention to the dish in the right-hand corner case, which is among the most beautiful works of early 13th century Kashan fruitware, or the brass sitting on the shelf here, which is perhaps the most famous work of Islamic metalwork in the United States, the so-called Freer Canteen. All these pieces were sold after Eumorfopoulos' death at an auction and ended up in collections around the world. However, if we look behind the screen, we can catch a glimpse of something which is quite new. And we owe this novelty to Eumorfopoulos' taste. This is his break with collecting tradition. And I will let him give us an idea of what this break consists of. In the preface to the catalogue of his personal collection in 1925, volume 1, there were 11 of those, he's saying, "It was in 1906 that I saw for the first time a few specimens of the tomb wares, and I was at once attracted by them. Archaeological appeal alone, however, has never induced me to acquire an object. To enter my collection, it was indispensable that it should at the same time appeal to me aesthetically in some way or another." Now, the archaeological appeal was very heavy, very important in Eumor's taste. As I said, he worked for Raleigh Brothers, and he would often go to the docks of London to receive, to collect merchandise coming from the Far East. And one particular merchandise that started arriving were these Tang or earlier Han Dynasty figures that were hardly collected in China ever before, or in the West, where they were completely unknown. Famously, it was the opening of railways in China that made these tomb wares available in the art trade. Eumorfopoulos was not at the time in 1906, 1909 very well off yet, so he couldn't compete with the people like Leyland collecting blue and white. So he would collect this much more easily and at huge, huge numbers. In 1910, at Burlington Fine Arts Club, where he was a member, there is the first exhibition in the history of the West dedicated to early Chinese art. He is by far the most important lender, and this camel, this figure of a camel, was one of the objects he presented there. Actually, he didn't have any Tang wares to show, like this, tomb wares, and when the exhibition opened in May, and later he got some halfway through the exhibition, and they added a display case, number M, and this camel sat in that display case. These archaeological objects were a way into the history of China. It was an early history that was very little known from objects in the West. Most people were not familiar. The museums, even the great state museums, didn't have any of this material. So China was not perceived as an ancient culture. Yes, in literature, but not in art. So here, there was, for the first time, an opportunity to delve into its antiquity. At the same time, we cannot deny the aesthetic appeal of these tomb figures, which were, I repeat, collected for the first time by Eumorfopoulos rather than a museum curator. And for example, in this so-called dancing horse, we see the sculptural qualities that must have caught his eye. And of course, there's exoticism. There are these strange hairdos, these beautiful dresses that must have appealed to a collector from the early 20th century that saw these things as a leeway into a new period of the past, undiscovered. And finally, I would argue that the archaeological appeal of these figures lay, for Eumorfopoulos specifically, in connections he could make with the Hellenistic and the Hellenic, broadly speaking. So this figure, which today we associate with a South or Southeast Asian dancer, in the catalogue of his collection is described as Hellenistic type, as probably someone coming from the West. So the Tang love for the exotic in the 8th century corresponding to the love for the exotic in the early 20th. I said that behind the screen was a whole different world than the tame interiors of the living quarters of the Eumorfopoulos residence. And this is true in the following photographs from the house, taken in 1934, just before he parted with the bulk of it, to which he sold to the British government. For example, here we see a room. The figures to the right in the large display case are today the centerpiece of the Houghton Gallery at the British Museum. And here to the right, there is the famous wooden Jin Dynasty Bodhisattva, the centerpiece of the Chinese Gallery at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Some archaic jades to the left. But beyond the archaeological, Eumorfopoulos talked about the aesthetic. And I think that the aesthetic is best exemplified in his case by the collection of Song ceramics which he amassed. The Song dynasty, the classical, if you prefer, period in the production of ceramics from the 10th to the 13th century, featured wares that were at once refined, beautifully sparse and restrained in decoration, vigorous, almost rough at times, spectacular in color, and challenging in technique. This actually is a later Ming example of a ware that began in the Song. And Eumorfopoulos also collected Korean art, which he appreciated very much for the spontaneity of execution and decoration. I would argue that he went even further. And he came to appreciate a very specific brand of aesthetics, very oriental, the imperfect. At the Benaki Museum collection, we have two examples of Longchuan stoneware dating from approximately the 12th century. There are two bowls which are warped. They were warped during firing, and so they were discarded by the potters, who thought that they were no good, they wouldn't sell. And they were obviously collected by Japanese visitors to China from the heaps near the kiln, and they were mended, as you can see, with gold lacquer in Japan. Now, this was a piece of garbage when it was made in the 12th century, but it became a rarefied object within a Japanese collecting milieu. And Eumorfopoulos collected 3 of those. He gave 2 to the Benaki, and the third is among the ceramics he sold to the British Museum. I'm not aware of any other of these Japanese mended Lunchuan bowls. Now, all these categories of the aesthetic, the refined, the rough, the spectacularly colorful, the spontaneous, and the imperfect, can be traced in an aspect of his collecting activity which is very little known. And I'm talking, of course, about his interest in contemporary art. Contemporary, at the time, modern for us. We believe that this head, which is today in Harvard Art Museums by Amedeo Modigliani, was part of the Eumorfopoulos collection. A stone head by Modigliani of the same dimensions appears at the auction catalog. It's not illustrated, but there are not that many of them around. And another photograph from the 1934 album features a picture of his study. And this is an unbelievable display of interwar sculpture, mostly of artists working in Britain. So we have work by Ivan Mestrovich, Henri Gaudier-Bresca, Jacob Epstein, and most importantly, I think, Barbara Hepworth. Barbara Hepworth's bust by her first husband, Skipping, sat on the entrance hall of the Eumorfopoulos residence. It is this bust, and we do not know its present whereabouts. In a book published in 1944, I found a very surprising description of Eumorfopoulos. One evening, the most famous of all private collectors arrived in a Rolls-Royce. It was the Greek millionaire, Eumorfopoulos, whose collection of modern art alone was supposed to be worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. Naturally, we kept out of the way while he was in the studio with Jack and Barbara. Jack was Skipping, Barbara's first husband. Barbara, of course, was Hepworth. Barbara was wearing her most exotic frock. He stayed a long time. He had bought sculptures from each of them, and I believe some of Jack's zoo drawings. I forget what the price was for everything, but it ran into hundreds of pounds. The zoo drawings are all around the bust, and we see them displayed, of course, with Chinese pots. So here we see another aspect to him. Eumorfopoulos, the patron of contemporary artists. And perhaps it was his contact with these artists and his immersion in modern art that enabled him to appreciate qualities in some of his ceramics, which were not particularly fashionable in the early part of the 20th century. They became very fashionable after the war. And the patronage extended beyond buying their output. The most interesting connection with a contemporary artist was with the potter duo, husband and wife duo, Charles and Nell Vyse. Charles is depicted in front of his kiln here, and Nell is the elegant lady to the right. This pot by Charles and Nell Vyse, they're always signed Charles, but I believe that Nell was instrumental in their production because she was the chemist genius, was part of the Eumorfopoulos collection, and it was sold after his death in 1940. And I would like us to see 3 examples of Vyse ceramics in comparison with items of ancient Chinese pottery in the Eumorfopoulos collection. The Vyse pot is to the right, produced in stoneware in 1934, and a Neolithic jar from the Eumorfopoulos collection appears on the left. They have the same jagged ribbons of decoration. Again, and 1933 bottle with ridges in a dark and brown glaze, and of course the Jin dynasty equivalent many centuries earlier from the Eumorfopoulos collection. And finally, a Jun Yao copy by the Vises. This one is undated, and the original from the 12th century. So it is clear that Eumorfopoulos was instrumental not just in buying the output of artists, but in opening up his collection to them. The Vises had a studio in Chelsea, not far from the Eumorfopoulos residence, and they would visit, like many people, on Sundays, which was an open day, to study the items in the collection. Inevitably, someone with such extensive holdings, with a collection finer than most museums anywhere in Europe or the States, became an iconic collector of Oriental art. And to give you an idea of how iconic, this is a cigarette card. You would find them in cigarette boxes, and you could collect them in series. And the series was Great Archaeological Discoveries of the 20th Century. And one of the cards was the Eumorfopoulos collection. Now, in 1934, affected by the crunch and, of course, his impeding retirement from Raleigh Brothers, Eumorfopoulos decided to sell the bulk of his collection to the British nation. Originally to the British Museum, but then the V&A stepped in, and for £100,000 at the time, which doesn't sound much today, but it was quite a staggering amount, they bought most of the collection. His fame, however, is mostly due not to that sale, but to the production of the 11-volume Eumorfopoulos collection catalogue. And I show you here just the 6 volumes of ceramics. The publication was done on subscription, and from the tabula congratulatoria at the beginning, we see here a small box of 3 people who bought the catalogue, who subscribed to the catalogue in Egypt. One of the 3 was Antonis Benakis. Now, Benakis had not met Eumorfopoulos before personally, but of course he knew about the collection already from before the publication of the catalogue, and as Mina has demonstrated, he was also himself a collector of Chinese art, not to the extent of Eumorfopoulos. The first link happens in 1927, and we have the letter at the Benaki archives. A certain Mr. Home introduces Eumorfopoulos and Benakis, and they click. The letter expresses the desire of Eumorfopoulos to give his collection to Greece. That is in 1927. However, we have a reference at another letter much later, where Gika, again, a figure you have encountered in this series of lectures, writes to a good friend of his. And it says, amazingly, that Eumorfopoulos suggested donating his entire collection to Greece, if only they built an appropriate museum. But Plastiras, says Gika, in the name of Greece, declined. Now, if Plastiras had declined, that could not have happened but in 1 year, 1922. So this tells us that 5 years before the contact with Benaki, Eumorfopoulos was already trying to give to Greece his Chinese collection, and amazingly, his entire collection. I dread to think what Greece would be today among Chinese art historians if we had the whole Eumorfopoulos collection. The entire collection never arrived, But Benakis was clever enough to understand that he would have to prize more and more from this rather unobtrusive, reluctant donor. So in 1929, he writes to Eumorfopoulos and he says, Mr. Venizelos, who is by then prime minister, the famous Greek politician, to whom I announced the arrival of your donation, is enthusiastic, and he promised me to do anything he can to exhibit it in the best possible way. Now, the notion of a prime minister of a country being enthusiastic about a few hundred Chinese pots arriving, actually without a museum to put them in, because at the time the Benaki Museum was still a sparkle in Benakis' eye, is extraordinary. And it tells us something about the quality of politicians we're dealing with in the interwar period. The collection that eventually, the selection of the collection that Eumorfopoulos decided to send to Greece had at its nucleus about 100 pots, which he had loaned to the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. And this is the list of this Fitzwilliam loan. This tells us that he meant the collection from the start as an educational tool. He gave these things as a study collection to a university museum. However, when he started giving to Greece, he kept on adding and adding. The Fitzwilliam loan was 104 objects, which he took from Cambridge and sent them to Athens, along with a few hundred more. The original gift in 1929 was 341. And then by 1936, he gave another 452, totaling about 800 pots. And the educational focus continued. He states in a letter that I send you 2 Neolithic jars, not because I like them, but because I think that Greek scholars will appreciate how much they look like Greek Neolithic pots. Now, these Greek Neolithic pots had only been discovered in the 20s, which means that he was very well aware of the archaeological discoveries happening in central Greece, in Dimini and Sesklo at the time. The display cases and the room, the gallery, the Eumorfopoulos room at the newly founded Benaki Museum was actually a paean to this educational idea. It fitted very well into Benakis' cosmopolitan scheme of bringing together Greek tradition, Chinese ceramics, Islamic art. And Eumorfopoulos gladly joined in. He even paid for the display cases to be made in London, and he shipped them from London. They were made by Sage & Co. of Gray's Inn Road near King's Cross. And he paid for Lee Ashton, who later became the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, to write the catalogue, published in 1939. What is most remarkable in all that is that Eumorfopoulos only came to Greece for the opening of the museum in 1931. He had never visited his country of origin before. And this exemplifies the idealistic donor, the patriotic benefactor that gives the cream of the crop of his collection to his country, and a country he never knew, a country, the language of which he spoke very well, but he wasn't really accustomed to its realities. In a way, the Eumorfopoulos gallery at the new Benaki Museum was a very idealistic project. Eumorfopoulos fell ill in 1935, and he recovered very briefly to visit China on the occasion of the great exhibition of the Royal Academy, and he died in December 1939. He's buried at the Greek enclosure of West Norwood Cemetery. 2 auctions after his death and after the death of his wife dispersed what remained of the collection. With Victoria Solomonides, the former cultural attaché of the Greek embassy, we tried twice to persuade English Heritage to put a blue plaque on his house, on the house on 7 Chelsea Embankment. A blue plaque is a commemorative plaque in London that tells you that this famous person lived here. They refused twice. But history moves in mysterious ways. Just opposite, you see the red dot is the house. The green dot across the river marks the spot where in 1985 a pagoda was erected. It is the London Peace Pagoda offered by Japan as a token of friendship towards the UK. They didn't know exactly where to put it, so they chose a position on the Battersea Park. And of course, they had completely forgotten that across the river, literally opposite, this is taken from the front door of Yuma's house, lived once the greatest collector of Chinese art the UK had seen. Let's consider this the unintended blue plaque to Eumorfopoulos. Now, why the last question? Why don't we know about this man and his collection? And that, of course, has to do with the destinies of Greece and of the Benaki after the war. The Eumorfopoulos collection and the Benaki bequest, of course, was all about a cosmopolitan spirit of seeing things together, of drawing connections, very much an interwar paradigm. In 1941, Manolis Hatzidakis, the famous Byzantinist, is appointed as director of the Benaki, and he rules supreme until 1973. Now, Hatzidakis, of course, is known as the main exponent of the studies, art historical studies into the Cretan school of painting, Greece's answer, in a way, to the Italian Renaissance. But Hatzidakis, few people know that, was trained on Benakis's instigation as an Islamic art historian, as an Arabic scholar in Paris and Berlin before the war. His tenure as director of the Benaki showed nothing of this particular instruction in the arts of the Middle East. He was staunchly oriented towards the West, towards the art of the Renaissance, and that was, of course, the main narrative of Greece in the Cold War era after World War II. A change came under his successor, Angelos Delivorias, who again ruled supreme from 1973 until 2014. Although trained as a classical archaeologist, Delivorias had a broader vision for the collection of the Benaki, an inclusive vision which he bequeathed to all of us through this chain of museums. And he created this satellite system, people may remember this slide from his lectures, into which the Chinese collection fitted well, not awkwardly, but very well in a global presentation of culture through art. Of course, having Greek culture at its center, at its main pole. Unfortunately, the recent recession from 1908 onwards did not allow him to finalize, to bring to fruition this vision he had. And the Chinese collection fell through the cracks of the historical destinies of the country. So it remains today in storage. It hasn't found a permanent home, a permanent display. But there are many ways of making a collection visible, of reassessing it. And we owe it to scholars that they have reevaluated this awkwardly sitting Benaki Museum collection. And I have to pledge my allegiance to three scholars who have inspired my work at the Benaki. One of them is Professor Kreklunas, who in the 1990s started researching early collectors of Chinese art in the UK. And he focused mostly on Alan Barlow, but he created a generation of scholars. Chief among them is Stacey Pearson, who is now teaching the history of Chinese ceramics at SOAS, who wrote a lot about people like Eumorfopoulos. The third one, Judith Green, didn't really deal with that after her PhD, but she wrote an MA thesis in which she placed Eumorfopoulos as the turning point into the appreciation of Chinese art in the West. And we owe to these people the fact that they enabled our collection to be rebranded, not only as a good historical collection of Chinese ceramics, but also as an important collection of taste in Chinese art. This whole moment was presented into a book published in 2016, and I'll show you a photograph of the launch of the book in London in July 2016. It's in a beautiful room, which is today the London Sketch Club. Take a look at the moldings. It's this room. We were able to bring Eumorfopoulos back into his house because a part of his house now operates as a club. So my publisher booked this room for the launch of the book on Eumorfopoulos. The museum at the same year found the opportunity to organize an exhibition called Ceramics from China in summer 2016. 100 of the pots came out of storage. The Chelsea embankment dust was wiped off them. They were placed in new display cases. And actually, some of the old display cases were located in the museum storage. We refurbished one of them and we used it in a typical 1930s fashion display on the collector. We even did a special menu for the restaurant, and we organized a very nice party for the exhibition to welcome back some of the pots into the museum family, even for a few months. It was a brief moment of remembrance of an unobtrusive collector whom we have denuded of his beautiful pots and sort of delved into and tried to understand over this, I hope, not too overlong lecture. So I will now let him wear his pots back, bring back his protection, and thank you for your attention. I will stop sharing my screen. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was delightful.
Thank you so much for that fantastic lecture. I'm sure there are many questions, but one that comes immediately to mind is, if you had a choice, how would the museum now exhibit the full collection? Would it be in a separate space, in a room in the gallery? What are the grand plans of the museum for this collection?
Well, one thing we have done, and I'm very proud for that, is that we have placed most of it, 700 ceramics, online. So you can go, you will get a document after the lecture we prepared, and you will get a link and you will be able to browse 700 of them. And actually, it's a pretty good coverage of our holdings. Now, but the digital does not replace the physical. You know, there is this attraction of the objects that we have to experience, we have to savor physically in front of us. It's quite extravagant to plan another branch of the Benaki right now. There are 10 as we speak. So perhaps a series of temporary shows rotating the collection in education-focused displays of a few things, covering specific subject matters, aspects of Chinese civilization, and so on and so forth. That would be perhaps more feasible and in the long run, perhaps more profitable for the audience.
Eumorfopoulos went to China in the last year of his life. Was that his first and only trip to China?
Yeah. Yes, and a few years before he died, 3 years before he died, it was the first and last time, and he was invited by the Chinese government.
We have many complimentary comments, and Lucia Nixon writes, I learned a great deal and fantastic to hear about Delivorias getting things right yet again.
Yes, I did, didn't she?
One question I have is, did he have children?
No. No, they lived with Julia Scaramanga, an interesting name. They lived for many decades together, but they never had children. And so the collection, whatever was not sold or given, was dispersed.
What happened to his collection of modern art?
It was auctioned. And I don't know if you noticed in the sculpture slide, they are now in various museums in the United States, in France, in the UK, but a lot of things are missing from this catalog. I don't know where they are. It's a very, and so, there's good things. There are Picassos, there's Matisses. I mean, he had nice stuff.
Now, how did he decide which works would go to the British Museum or the V&A and which would go to the Benaki, other than moving the Cambridge collection to the Benaki? Was he aware of was there a particular character to each of these collections?
Well, the Benaki collection is ceramics only. So he picked pottery as the ideal medium. And that's not unusual for his generation and also for the British temperament. A friend of mine who is a British collector always says, oh, the British pots. Whereas you see American collectors focused on painting or Buddhist sculpture, etc. But Eumorfopoulos had everything. He had, as we saw, jade, sculpture, painting on silk, even wall paintings. I think he chose the ceramics for the Benaki because he thought he could write a history, a more coherent history, without gaps. You would have gaps in painting, you would have gaps in sculpture, but you didn't have many gaps in the historical narrative with pottery. It survives better, and he had more material to give. And I to be honest, I think that people like Robert Lockhart Hobson or Lee Ashton, working for the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert, they had first pick. Mm-hmm. That was the problem. Benakis was in Athens. He couldn't sort of get his fingers on some things. Yeah. But he gave very, very beautiful things as well to Greece.
We have a request from Maria, I think probably Vasilaki. May I make a comment about Christina Spartali?
Of course, yes. I'm delighted.
Maria,
I think yes. I mean, first of all, I find her case very, very interesting. But what I find more interesting is that she was an artist herself. She was a painter. So yes. she didn't only pose to those famous pre-Raphaelite painters, but she was a painter herself in the last decades of the 19th century. So, which is quite nice to underline. And as a woman and a feminist myself, I would really like to bring it out. Because, you
And
know,
Maria
this is a
Zapata was
man's
a
world. I'm afraid, George, this is a man's world. But as you can see, there are women who need more light to be thrown on them. And I have to say that, I mean, it's not by accident that only recently her case has been brought up in London. And I mean, especially for me, there were two exhibitions, one in Tate Britain and another in the National Portrait Gallery, which, I mean, the first one, I think it was on Edward Burne-Jones, and she had posed for him. But the second one, which which was called the Pre-Raphaelite Sisters, really underlined her artistic creations, I mean, her paintings. So it was a room where you could see, and I mean, that was a rather recent exhibition. I think now we're confused with the lockdown. Time has taken another dimension, but I think it was in September 2019. I mean, it's not a long time ago that we were able to see her work. And I mean, of course, this is a parenthesis into your wonderful lecture, but I think it's nice to bring her case out, because
yes, we have to do an exhibition of on these ladies at the Benaki one day.
That's a very good idea.
Something I would love to do.
Okay.
They deserve it, absolutely.
That's very good news. Yes, because it was a whole group of Greek women. Of course, I mean, belonging to from a wealthy background. I'm not saying that they made it to the world, but I mean, even so, they made it to the world. Yes.
George, have you given up on creating or securing a blue plaque for the house? Do you think the monument suffices, or can there be more?
They don't do blue plaques anymore.
Okay.
They stopped. English Heritage stopped doing it. So we missed that window.
Πολύ κρίμα. We have a question from Lefteris Georgios, I think is writing from Santorini. Are there more kintsugi at the Benaki collection? Any thoughts of an exhibition specifically on this important art form?
Yes, we do. We do have more. On various different, sort of mostly Song and Jin and Yuan pots. And we could do, I mean, there are not that many to do a special exhibition, but one can do a pop-up exhibition because people love it. You know, it's very interesting. It has become a sort of a trend now to talk about kinaoshi or kintsugi, you know, about these Japanese gold mends on imperfect pieces. And so, yes, it's a good idea, actually. We'll pursue that.
Did Eumorfopoulos have a favorite piece? Sometimes collectors hold on to that favorite piece until the very end. It's the last one they want to part with. Do we know anything about his love of specific pieces in his collection?
I don't really know. No, I think, I mean, he had so many. I mean, he had literally dozens of thousands of objects. But I do know that he changed his taste and he started collecting early Ming blue and white, really fine Chuande, Yongle, Chenhua, blue and white after the sale, so after 1934. And so he sort of shifted his taste. He went from porcelain to an archaeological, back to porcelain, etc.
Are there other questions? I think maybe we should make a plan when the world opens again for all of us to meet at 7 Chelsea Embankment, to go in and see this room and experience the world of Eumorfopoulos from his space and what he saw outside his door and the nature around him as well. Thank you so much for bringing him to life so vividly for all of us. It's a fantastic lecture.
Thank you.
So we'll reconvene next week, same time, same place, 10 o'clock Thursday morning, to move to the ancient world. And we'll see if we can find some other special treat, but I encourage everybody to think about the director's scones as you move through your day, and you'll be getting the recipe later today. Please make them and think about Dr. George Manginis when you eat your special scone. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for being here today. Thank you. Thank you, George.